All right, WPRK, Winter Park, Florida. I am joined by Stephen Miller, the Senior Policy Advisor for Donald Trump's campaign. How are you, Stephen?
Hey, it's great to be with you today, and we are looking forward to an historic day on Tuesday.
Yes, the big day of the Florida primary. So, just got a few questions here for you. I've been following the campaign pretty closely, and it's been very interesting to say the least. I thought I would talk to you about some policy stuff very quickly. So, as you know, Trump recently received the endorsement of Senator Jeff Sessions, who has a track record of being very strong on things like illegal immigration. Has Donald Trump already exchanged ideas with the senator? Anything specifically?
Yes, well, in fact, I used to work for Senator Jeff Sessions before coming over to join the Trump campaign. And one of my major issues, one of my portfolios in Senator Sessions' office was immigration. Sessions and Trump have consulted on numerous occasions on immigration policy, and Trump reached out to Senator Sessions early on in the campaign, knowing that Senator Sessions is one of the best experts on immigration policy, and that had been, of course, a signature part of Trump's campaign from the very day that he announced. Mm-hmm. So, yes, there is a great working relationship there, and your listeners can take confidence or can have confidence in knowing that that relationship will continue after Trump wins the nomination and on into the White House in terms of developing an immigration policy that works for American workers. And that's really the bottom line, and that's one of the big differences in this race. Mm-hmm. If you look at, for instance, the Florida's absentee senator, Marco Rubio ran in 2010, and I know you remember it well, on a campaign pledge to block amnesty. I'm sure you recall vividly his debates with former Governor Charlie Crist, where he criticized Crist aggressively for pushing a amnesty bill for Dreamers. Mm-hmm. After getting elected to the Senate on that promise, Marco Rubio didn't just push amnesty. Marco Rubio became the most pro-amnesty lawmaker in the history of the United States of America. He pushed the worst, biggest, most disastrous, calamitous amnesty bill that anyone had ever seen in all of American history. And that legislation would have legalized and given citizenship to 12 million illegal aliens, given them work permits to take American jobs, given them access to benefits that your listeners would have to pay for. So your listeners would be funding Medicare for illegal immigrants, Social Security for illegal immigrants, education for illegal immigrants, tax credits for illegal immigrants, food stamps for illegal immigrants, public housing for illegal immigrants, cash welfare for illegal immigrants, and on and on and on and on and on, coming right out of their pocket. So Senator Rubio betrayed every single person in your listening audience today. He lied to them, he lied to their families, and he didn't just put their wallets at risk, he put their lives at risk. I had a conversation yesterday, and every time I have a conversation like this, it just breaks my heart, and I can't imagine what it's like for the parents who've lost their children to illegal immigrants. It defies comprehension. But I was talking to a father whose son was murdered in cold blood, shot in the head after dropping his girlfriend off at home. And he was the assailant was an illegal immigrant who had been deported on multiple previous occasions. And that father lost his son because we don't have a border and because we don't enforce our immigration laws. I had a conversation this week with a family who lost their daughter to illegal immigration in a horrific vehicular homicide. Mm-hmm. And that illegal alien is now at large. They were being held in a local jail after the slaughter, and Obama's immigration enforcement department refused to hold them. They were released. That illegal alien is now at large. We have completely and totally betrayed the citizens of this country, putting their wallets at risk, but putting their lives at risk. And the Trump campaign is going to restore the social contract and make sure that the American people are given the protection financially, but also in terms of their physical security, given the protection of their borders.
So just going along that line, Trump has already said, he's made it very clear that anyone staying in the U.S. illegally is going to be sent back to their country of origin. Now, what if countries that are south of the border, or rather anywhere else at that, refuse to take these people back? Would Trump refuse legal entry from countries that do not accept their deported citizens as a way to make them comply? How does he plan on addressing that?
That's such a fabulous question. I'm so glad that you asked that question, because it's the kind of question that you don't often get asked, and it suggests that you have really studied this issue at great depth. So I really just want to applaud you for asking such a great question, because a lot of people don't know this. And if you allow me, I want to just take the moment here to fill in people on this, because I think a lot of people, because you don't read it so much in the newspapers, a lot of countries refuse to take back their illegal aliens, including, most dangerously, their criminal aliens. So I'm sure we've all read these reports of the Obama administration releasing tens of thousands of criminal aliens. Now, most of the time, those releases are because the Obama administration just doesn't want to hold them. They just don't want to hold them. They don't want to hold them. They don't want to deport them. They just don't want to. They figure, you know what, we'll release them. And then, of course, as a result, more Americans die, more Americans get robbed, more Americans get victimized. But there's also a number of cases where there's, say, someone convicted of a heinous crime, like a homicide, and the country of origin will refuse to accept them. The Obama administration just rolls over and releases the alien back into American communities where they can prey on Americans. But, and you alluded to this, we have tools in law to stop that problem. We have several of them. One of them is the cancellation of visas to countries that refuse to repatriate their aliens. Mm-hmm. And if you go to DonaldJTrump.com and look at his immigration white paper, it actually addresses that issue and talks about canceling visas to countries that won't repatriate their aliens. Look, this is a good neighbor's policy. You can't be an ally of the United States, have a citizen of your country illegally come into our country, maim, wound, kill our innocent civilians, and then you won't take them back. Mm-hmm. That can't happen anymore. Another tool we have is to address the foreign aid piece. And, that's something that would get looked at too. And another tool that we have is also the trade piece. If you look at Mexico, right, and Mexico is ripping us off on trade. So we have a lot of leverage with these countries. And I'm not going to make any specific policy announcements today about what the exact plan would be, but all options are on the table for dealing with that problem. One last thing I will say is that under no circumstance should the United States release back into U.S. communities criminal aliens because their home countries won't take them back. Whether it's changing our laws, whether it's changing our negotiation policies, or whether it's using tools we already have in law, that has to end. Because the number of acceptable civilian casualties from illegal immigration is zero. The number of acceptable burials each year where parents are mourning over a coffin of a son or daughter killed by an illegal immigrant is zero. The goal has to be zero. And so when you hear people say, and I'm sure you've heard it before, right? Well, we don't want to deport people for minor offenses. Well, let's think about that for a second. I'll tell you, and I appreciate you being so patient with me, but it's so important. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you about a case that really speaks to this. And there's thousands of cases like this all over the country. And I've spoken before to family members of people who've lost people to cases just like this. So in 2008, there was a case in Minnesota in a small town called Cottonwood, beautiful, idyllic American town. Mm-hmm. And there was an illegal alien in that town, and she was driving recklessly, plowed right through a stop sign as if it wasn't even there at high speed, and T-bones a school bus, just absolutely smashes into the side of a school bus and kills 4 young children. 4 young children dead. Can you imagine the phone call those parents got that day that they probably hear over and over again in their head every day for the rest of their lives? Including one couple lost 2 brothers, their only 2 kids, 2 brothers, who went to school that morning thinking that they had their whole lives ahead of them and cut short. Well, that driver that illegal alien had been pulled over before for one of these so-called minor offenses, right? Probably, I think that it was like a reckless driving incident. And she also had an illegal license, an illegal identity, illegal job, right? Those are these so-called minor offenses, right? Stealing a job, stealing a social security number, stealing an identity, driving illegally, driving recklessly. Well, these so-called minor offenses were ignored and she wasn't deported. Well, because she wasn't deported, because these minor offenses were ignored, 4 kids were killed. So as a society, we have to ask ourselves, what makes more sense? To not deport people for minor offenses and then see how many people get killed or lose their jobs or lose their security or lose their incomes as a result, or to proactively enforce our immigration laws and keep the country safe. And think what that will do for the economy in terms of opening up jobs, for the tax base, in terms of reducing welfare payments, in terms of our budget deficit, in terms of reducing the cost of entitlements, in terms of our security, reducing gangs, reducing drugs, reducing cartels, and in terms of our middle class, in terms of increasing wages. So this really is about what our priority is as a country. Is it the Marco Rubio vision of benefiting illegal immigrants, or is it the Donald Trump vision of benefiting Florida citizens and legal Americans?
We're talking here with Stephen Miller, again, the senior policy advisor for Donald J. Trump. And I guess that's a good segue into my next question. The Tax Foundation estimates that a Trump tax plan will reduce tax revenues by over $10 trillion by the end of the next decade. How are we, as citizens, supposed to take Trump's economic plan seriously if there aren't the spending cuts that help offset this lack of revenue?
Well, this is a really great question, too, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about the budget deficit. And you hear a lot, I'm sure, right, about how Social Security and Medicare are the drivers of the deficit. I'm sure you've heard that comment before. Social Security and Medicare do have issues in the long term with fiscal sustainability. And one important way to address that, obviously, would be to increase overall economic prosperity and the amount of people working and contributing to these programs. And I'll get back to that in a second. But Social Security and Medicare are contribution programs, right? You pay into them and you draw out. Now, obviously, for some workers, you're going to draw out more than you pay in, but they're not free programs. These are contribution programs. The part of the conversation everyone seems to leave out is, what's the biggest expenditure in the budget? What's bigger than Medicare? What's bigger than Social Security? It's welfare. And a lot of times this never gets discussed. I'm always amazed that you hear all these debates. Everyone's always talking about Social Security and Medicare. But the welfare payments are actually bigger. We spend about $1 trillion a year. It's like $700 billion for Social Security and about like $550 for Medicare. Those are not exact, but just rounding. And then we have about $1 trillion a year on welfare. And that covers about 80 different programs. It's your food stamps, your public housing, your temporary assistance for needy families, your supplemental security income, your WIC payments, your home heating and energy assistance payments. It's a lot of different programs, and collectively they cost about $1 trillion a year. You would do more to reduce the budget deficit by returning America to full employment than anything else that you could possibly do. So if you look, for instance, at like our labor force participation rate, it's down to the lowest level in 4 decades. And you look at our wages, which have been declining relative to the price of living for decades now. And so what that does is it puts tens of millions of people on welfare, either because they're not working at all or because they're working in low-paying jobs that have such low wages that they qualify for welfare and income subsidies, which is a large portion of the welfare budget. You would save trillions of dollars by having a program to transition people from welfare to high-paying jobs. And enforcing your immigration laws is immediately going to do that to the tune of millions of people. You add on top of that our trade policy. We don't do anything to protect our trade jobs. In fact, we actively push policies that offshore our trade jobs. If you create a full employment economy and a high wage economy with a robust manufacturing sector, you're going to do wonders to shrink the deficit. Now you add on top of that a few other things. Now you hear a lot about how there's no waste, fraud, and abuse. It's only going to save a few $1 billion. Washington uses all kinds of phony accounting gimmicks to make it seem like there's less waste and abuse than there is. a great example of this, and I remember this because I used to work on the budget committee, is they'd say with the food stamp program, they'd always say, there's only like 2% waste. They said only 2% fraud is what they would always say. So we went and we looked at the numbers and we said, boy, it seems like there'd be a lot more fraud in food stamps than 2%. So we went and looked at the numbers. It was 2% was the payment error rate. And what that means is that they were saying 2% of the time they wanted to mail it to John Smith living on Cedar Avenue, and they accidentally mailed it to like John Smith living on Willow Lane. That's the only way they defined it. They just even mailed to the wrong person. Mm-hmm. They didn't even measure whether the person receiving it should have been receiving it all in the first place. In other words, did they have a side job they weren't reporting? Gotcha. Did they have a source of income they were leaving off the books? Were they selling food stamp cards in the black market? Were they living in their aunt's house and therefore having a whole separate source of living expenses paid for that they weren't disclosing? All that kind of stuff wasn't even measured. So when you look underneath the hood, you're going to find that the percentage of these programs that are going out incorrectly is much higher than anybody imagined. Now, I'll add one other thing, which is that, he's already talked about this, so he's talked about negotiating better drug prices, so I'll just leave that at that. That will save billions of dollars. But another big one, and I'll keep returning to this because it's a big one, it is one of the biggest issues facing our country, and I'll return to it again, is immigration. We spend $113 billion a year on illegal immigration alone. Now you add on top of that the cost of all of our other immigration programs, like, for instance, our refugee programs. More than 90% of recent Middle Eastern refugees are on welfare. Mm-hmm. Each 10,000 refugees has a lifetime cost of $6.5 billion. We admit 100,000 refugees and asylum seekers every year. And then you imagine layering that on year after year after year after year, and that's just one program. Then you think about our green card program and all the low-skilled workers that are coming in on that who have lifetime access to welfare. In fact, 1 in 2 immigrants in the United States is currently receiving some kind of welfare assistance, or immigrant households is receiving some kind of welfare assistance. So enforcing our immigration laws, including our unenforced restrictions on welfare usage, completely unenforced, it's in the law, we don't use it, will save long-term trillions with the T, trillions of dollars. So again, we have to ask ourselves as a country, do you want the traditional corporate Washington model of Republicans coming in and saying, well, we're not going to fix welfare, we're not going to fix immigration, we're not going to fix trade, we're not going to fix waste, we're not going to fix abuse, we're not going to we're just going to go after Social Security and Medicare? Is that really a winning formula? Or shouldn't we really start by looking at all the other things I just mentioned? So that's my answer on that.
So got one last question here for Stephen Miller, the senior policy advisor for Donald Trump's campaign. I want to thank you very much for coming on again. Since this is a college radio station, we get a lot of my listeners ask us about what politicians will do to make college more affordable. As you can imagine, many college-age voters find people like Bernie Sanders' policies to make college free appealing. What can Donald Trump do to appeal to the college-age voters who are swamped with student loan debt?
Okay, well, that's another excellent question, and I'm very glad that you asked it too. Now, one of the things, of course, as you know, driving the high price of college education is unwise interventions from the federal government. Basically, you're creating a debt bubble where the federal government basically underwrites these outrageous, out-of-control tuition prices. So the federal government has a huge amount of unused leverage. In other words, basically, the system is that the colleges keep jacking up tuition, right? And the federal government keeps underwriting these student loans. What the federal government could do and should do is make it clear to colleges that circular that cycle is going to be broken, that they can't just keep jacking up tuition and then they're going to keep underwriting it. In other words, the federal government holds all the cards. It's similar to the drug prices thing. The federal government has leverage to get colleges to bring down tuition prices as long as the government is underwriting these loans. I will make another point that's very important, though, as long as we're talking about college debt. It's very, very, very important that our college students have jobs when they graduate. So I want to be very, very clear about a major difference on this issue. I am certain that a lot of people listening to your program today are majoring in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, or know people who are. And I'll add to that also healthcare policy too, because that's covered here as well. There is a program known as the H-1B visa, in which cheaper, lower-paid, lesser-skilled bonded guest workers are brought in from foreign countries to fill jobs in lieu of American college graduates. We graduate 2 times more students in those fields I mentioned every year than find jobs in those fields. 2/3 of all new entry-level hires in the information technology field are low-paid foreign guest workers. Again, they're brought in explicitly to take a job at a lower wage for 3 or 6 years and then get sent home. We've seen tragically in Orlando how American workers were forced to train their H-1B replacements. Donald Trump is the only candidate who's proposing that jobs go to American college students first, immigrant and U.S. born alike, that the college students already living and dreaming here in the United States will get preference for jobs when they graduate, and that large transnational corporations funding the Cruz and Rubio campaign won't get to replace your listeners with lower paid guest workers. And that is a huge issue because American college students and Florida college students are getting hammered. And that includes Black and Hispanic college students who are being passed over in favor of lower paid foreign guest workers. That will end under a Trump administration, and we're going to help all of our workers, including our struggling workers living in minority communities, get preference for jobs in the United States.
Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Miller. Hopefully we can have you on again when I have some more time. We are running out, but thank you very much, and want to wish you guys best of luck on Tuesday.
Great, thanks. Look forward to being in touch.
Take care, sir.